When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Access to information is a central concern in debates about how we might improve our public sphere, our public discourse. This issue always comes back to the ideal public sphere, a space where citizens can potentially gather to exchange ideas and deliberate on important social issues. In this space, arguments are rational, all voices can be heard, and facts are freely available. But achieving that ideal is pretty much easier said than done. Historically, moments of expansive information and access have bolstered public discourse. Think of the rise of the printing press in the 15th century, which rapidly spread ideas around and spurred the Protestant Reformation. Or consider the internet's early promise as a force of democracy, giving everyday people a platform to share their ideas. And yet the same tools that broaden access can also fragment it. Today, algorithms serve us curated news feeds, reinforcing our beliefs instead of challenging them. The public sphere becomes fractured into echo chambers, where misinformation can thrive and productive debate can dwindle. And this isn't just a social issue or a political issue, it happens in our relationships as well. Imagine you and a friend are deciding how to spend a vacation. You want transparency and access to all the possible places that you could vacation, but the partner is strategically withholding what they really want or different places that they've been before. Without a shared understanding of possibilities and facts, resolving conflicts and making decisions is highly unlikely. Recognizing these patterns can allow us to push back and make reforms, whether it's fact-checking or teaching citizens constructive ways to discuss factual disputes, teaching citizens how to look for good sources of information, or promoting journalism, or insisting on honest communication in our personal relationships. Advocating for transparency is key. Access to information fosters accountability, understanding, and potentially a more authentic dialogue. After all, a productive conversation in the public sphere or at the kitchen table requires everyone to be participating in at least roughly the same conversation. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Catherine Joyce. Catherine is the Program Director for the Civil Discourse for Citizenship program in the Center for Ethics and Human Values at Ohio State University. She has a PhD in philosophy. Catherine, tell us an argument story.
Thanks for having me. So the story I want to tell is from when I was an undergraduate student taking an American history class. And so this was my sophomore year of college. And I had this disagreement with the professor that started out as a disagreement about test questions, but really was a deeper disagreement about the terms of the professor-student relationship, I think. So what happened is this teacher, this history professor, he'd been doing this a long time, decades, and he would give lectures without any slides or anything like that. And then we'd read the book and he'd give tests, pretty standard setup. The problem is that I'd study for these tests and then I'd get them back and I'd see that questions I was really confident about were wrong, or there'd be questions on the test where I was pretty confident there was nothing in the reading about those questions. And so I went to see him just to ask for clarification. And in that meeting, it became clear that he's been using the same tests for years, but he had changed the textbook recently. And so he's saying, well, these tests are fine. I've been using them for years and history doesn't change. Like, okay, but some of this isn't in the book. Or I would show him actually like conflicting statements or statements that confuse the issue in the book. And he usually kind of blew me off. He's sort of defensive, dismissive. But in a few cases, he actually said, okay, fine, I can give you credit for that answer. But this happened after every test because every test is one that was corresponding to a different book. And maybe the lectures, but you can't study lectures if there's no notes or anything. So at one point he said to me, look, you and I don't get along. We both know it, but we still need to get through this semester. And that really surprised me because I was frustrated with him and with the class and with the tests, but
Yeah.
I didn't think of this as not getting along, me going to see him to ask him these questions and point out these problems.
Did you feel like he had he had kind of unnecessarily personalized the issue. You were making perfectly reasonable professional critiques or even asking for explanations within the boundaries of the class professor student relationship that's pretty standard and typical. And then he's like, well, you don't like me, I don't like you. So,
Yeah, I mean, it did seem personal. It seemed like he felt that his authority as a professor entitled him to some sort of deference or trust or not being questioned essentially by a student. But to me, it was an issue of fairness. And now that I'm a professor, now that I
uh,
teach, I still think about this a lot because I mean that's why it stuck with me for almost 20 years as I teach now. And I think it's important for students to be able to hold the professors accountable. And I'm not sure that we really always teach them that. And in that case, I was assuming as adults that would be an appropriate thing to do. And he was assuming that as a student, I should just go along with what he said.
was this so surprising to you at the time? And then, of course, so sticky and memorable for you for a minute afterwards, I presume, because you had never run into a professor who was kind of being lazy, frankly, about test questions? Was it because you had never run into somebody in a position of authority, especially an intellectual in a position of authority, opting for such kind of base motivations like, well, this is just about personal dislike. This is actually not about professional conduct. Something else, all of the above. In other words, why is this so sticky?
I think it was because I hadn't thought of myself as doing something inappropriate, but that's essentially what he suggested to me. And so then I felt sort of bad about it, like I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be. And this, I think, was the semester of my sophomore year, first semester of sophomore year. So I hadn't been in college for very long, and I hadn't had to do this with other professors. I'd go to office hours to ask questions, but I didn't have this issue with exams where there was just this clear disagreement with the textbook. And so I hadn't run into it before, and then I was like questioning myself if I had done something wrong and if I was being kind of the problem child in class and what else I should be doing. And sort of, I was surprised by him not not feeling that he was accountable to me. And he even said multiple times, "No student has complained about this before."
Oh, there we
And
go.
so really calling out that I'm the student who's making a big deal of this and no one else has.
And that's a shaming response.
Yeah.
You're making a big deal about this, and nobody else is seen to make a big deal about this. So he's shameless, and you are shameful. And he sets that dichotomy up again, personalizing an issue of kind of a basic question of what's going to be on the test and where is it coming from.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, how has this impacted your scholastics, your studies, your approach to teaching, your approach to the work of dialogue on and off campus at Ohio State?
Well, it makes me think about dialogue when there's differences in authority and power connected to different positions. So not just, social stratification or social hierarchies, but there is a necessary difference in authority between a professor and a student. But having disagreements across those differences is something that I think about a lot. And then I think about that story. And I think that most people who teach college students are much more reasonable and concerned about fairness than this particular professor. And so they're open to having students come to them with with these questions or these complaints. But I guess for me, because I had that experience, I take it even further and I think about how I can encourage students to hold me accountable and learn to be holding people accountable, even if it is their boss or their professor or someone who is in a position of power over them.
How do you invite accountability when you're in kind of an up power position?
Well, I mean, I tell students that we all make mistakes and that I've made mistakes before, and all professors make mistakes. And so if they think maybe there's a mistake or they just want an explanation, they're very much entitled to that. And you have to be careful because you don't want to tell them that all grades are negotiable or test answers are negotiable or something like that. But certainly you should be willing to justify to them what the grade was or what the requirements of the class are, and you should be able to explain if you're departing from what you've said you'll do in class or what you are reasonably expected to do.
Yeah.
So I make, yeah, go ahead.
Is is
Sorry.
there a part of you that is concerned about the risk of let's say disrespect or assuming incompetence or kind of giving too much before it's necessary?
It hasn't been a problem.
Yeah.
That hasn't been a problem. Students are really hesitant, I find, to hold professors accountable. Not always at, excuse me, not always at really prestigious schools where students might have experience doing this, or maybe even in their high schools and their families, they've been taught that they're entitled to this sort of challenge or to take this sort of active role. But at Ohio State or a place like Georgia State, or I was at the University of North Dakota, students don't always have that sort of confidence, and so I I don't worry about them taking it too far.
Yeah.
My experience is they don't take it far enough.
Let's take it outside of the context of the student teacher relationship and talk about
Mhm.
all sorts of other power imbalances that can happen when there's the necessity of dialogue or debate or disagreement.
Sure.
What are some things that folks outside of the classroom can do if they're in an up power position to encourage accountability in these kinds of exchanges?
You mean if they're the more powerful person?
Yeah, yeah,
Well, one thing is to be really aware in these conversations that it's hard for the other person to challenge you. And so have even more humility than you might otherwise have. And you might even help them kind of think about what questions they might have or objections they might have, anticipate those, explain those, and really be inviting students to disagree with you, and making it okay. I think that's
yeah.
what I do, so that when I'm giving a student an answer and they're nodding along, I want to be sure that I'm checking with them and being really encouraging of them to give me an honest response. Does that make sense? Does that not make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think the person in a position of power has to be aware of how difficult it is to be on the other side and be actively enabling that dialogue.
Let's flip it and talk about kinds of judging from your work and your experiences, kinds of a piece of advice you would give to folks who are facing a necessary conflict, but they come at that conflict in a relatively down power position.
Yeah, that's always a lot tougher because if you have someone who is in a position where they can shut you down if they want to, there's not much you can do if they take that position. But I think that you can appeal to, uh, shared values or a shared mission, and
Yeah.
just I know that fairness matters to you, fairness matters to me.
Mm.
Here's something that seems unfair. Can we talk about it?
Hmm.
And so I think going in with this request for talking about something rather than like accusations, I think in any situation, power differentials or not, you want to approach people in a way that doesn't put them on their heels or put them on the defensive right away. And so go in assuming that there might be a perfectly reasonable explanation, and go in and ask for that explanation, try to understand it. And if it turns out it's not a reasonable explanation, then that's the time to raise those concerns and continue the dialogue.
Well said. When I do workshops and trainings on some of these related issues relevant to tips for better disagreement or listening better, things of this nature, I often talk about the both the tacit and the explicit principle of reciprocity in
Hmm.
conversations. And you touched on that a bit, which is this sense of shared value. You believe in fairness, I believe in fairness. Let's proceed to enact a conversation and hopefully a result that's fair as well. Why do you think that principle of reciprocity is so persuasive in these kinds of encounters?
I think that it can be hard to refuse to give something back to someone when they've given it to you. So here's what I mean. Um, if you ask someone a question, you're trying to really understand their point of view. And so you're listening with curiosity, you're reserving judgment, and truly trying to understand. And you can demonstrate that to them by, repeating back to them what you think they've said until they agree that, yes, you understand what I'm saying. If you do that for someone, that's that's a way of making people feel heard. And it's, it feels really good to get that from someone. And then you're in a good position to say, okay, um, I understand what you've said. Now, would you mind if I explain my point of view? Because there's some differences with how I see things. It's pretty hard to say no there, I think.
Yeah, well said. What's your favorite part about doing this kind of dialogue work?
I think my favorite part is empowering people to uh, have better relationships and feel like they can have conversations and with people who disagree with them without it being a conflict or a fight. I see a lot of students and a lot of people I interact with estranged from family members, or even wanting to form friendships across, on the same political side, and feeling like they can't be friends with someone who disagrees with their politics. And I think that's unfortunate. And so giving people tools where they can really have these sorts of conversations in a productive way without just writing each other off or getting upset or feeling dismissed. That's my favorite part about doing the civil discourse work.
It's interesting that you pitched the benefits in terms of human connection, right? The benefits in terms of reducing estrangement and alienation. So often when we talk about this kind of work, especially in a polarized climate, we're talking about avoiding fights, avoiding violence, et cetera, right? Bigotry, red states, blue states, these kind of huge antagonistic
Mhm.
collisions. And here you're talking about the basis and necessity of individual one-on-one or one-on group relationships from which we are a little distant right now.
Right. And I think it's important that we are able to learn from one another and have conversations with people and see that they're human beings and have reasons for the positions they hold. And the reasons they have are not always the reasons we think they have. And so sort of engaging people, even those, especially those who disagree with us, in this sort of shared inquiry type of approach. Like, okay, well, let's explore this together because we disagree. Why do we disagree? Where do we disagree?
What is your biggest worry about this kind of work?
Well, some situations are not appropriate situations for civil discourse.
Mm.
And so we always try to be clear about that when we're talking to different groups of people, because I would hate for someone to be using the civil discourse and dialogue tools that we offer with someone who is actively trying to manipulate or coerce them, or someone who's not operating in good faith. And that could be bad for them.
Say
So
more about
that's my,
say more about
oh,
that.
yeah. So,
Talk about the bad faith part, and then talk about why using the tactics of civility and civil discourse in a situation of potential manipulation might actually make it worse.
great. So we have four principles of civil discourse we call the four C's. So be curious, be charitable, be conscientious, and be constructive. And when you use those in a conversation where others are also engaging in good faith, in that they're giving reasons, they're listening, they're not trying to just persuade you by saying anything they want. Those are really good tools to use. But when you get into a conversation with someone who is just looking for ways to manipulate you, sort of putting yourself out there by being curious and being really charitable can just give them sort of fuel for the fire. And one kind of person I have in mind is what's known as a high conflict person, or a person with a high conflict personality. This is a term that comes from Bill Eddy. And these are people who are very emotionally volatile, very preoccupied with blame and avoiding blame and blaming others, and are willing to act in ways that 90% of adults wouldn't act. And so when you're talking to someone who is seeking conflict, seeking blame, using these sorts of tools can actually be a disadvantage, because you're showing epistemic humility, but they're going to use that as like a way to blame you for something. You're considering that they might be right. That's part of civil discourse. Consider that the other person might
Right.
be right. But if you're doing that with someone who's just looking for a way to blame you, that can be damaging. That could be counterproductive.
Uh, so, at the risk of simplicity, then what?
Well, I think that you just have to recognize that you can't have a civil discourse with a person like that.
Hmm.
Um, a person who's not willing or capable of engaging in this kind of discussion. You have to be able to identify that and then not engage in that way with that person.
And this may be kind of a compulsiveness. It's not necessarily a tactic or strategy, some kind of rational approach this person is making. High conflict people can come from all sorts of environments, but I'm trying to
Sure.
draw a distinction too between that and the sort of purposeful provocateur, somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's goading and is as uncharitable as possible, and maybe they're deeply online and are interested in gaining clicks and likes and views and the whole thing because they are engaged in a kind of schadenfreude of pissing you off on purpose.
That's not a person who's willing to engage in civil discourse, and you can't engage in civil discourse with someone without their consent, we say sometimes.
Uh-huh.
They're not doing it. It takes both or all people in the conversation to be willing to do it. So, sometimes I'll be having a conversation with someone a little less extreme, but still who's very much in the mode of persuasion and
Hmm.
wanting to persuade me. And I'm trying to do the civil discourse thing, and they're trying to do the persuade me to believe what they believe thing. And so I'll just stop and say, okay, I'm really not interested in having a conversation where you try to convince me I'm wrong. I'm not trying to convince you I'm right. Like, if you want to have a conversation where we try to understand each other better and try to understand where we disagree, and then maybe have future conversations about, you know, what the better way to go on that point of disagreement is, like, I'm willing to have that conversation, but I'm not willing to talk to you if all you want to do is try to convince me that you're right.
We've been talking about this in terms of polarities a little bit. On the
Mhm.
one hand, we have the 4C's civil discourse method, and then on the others, we have these instances in which it's not appropriate. One of those is if you can suss out whether the person is a high conflict person. Another is if you can suss out whether if they're potentially engaged in being purposefully contrarian for whatever reason.
Mhm.
But oftentimes there is a kind of blurring of these boundaries where you and I can be perhaps kind of a little contrarian in the heat of a moment. Maybe we think it's purposeful and it's valuable, or maybe we're just hot and we're emotional. Um, we can be provocative. Certainly, all of us can use shame and blame and more high conflict tactics without being high conflict people, and then lapse
Yeah.
back into civil discourse methods. And so sometimes it can be hard to diagnose. Is this a civil conversation? Is this a high conflict conversation? You get where I'm going with this.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
how do you? Uh, the world can be a confusing place, and how are you? How are those of us who are interested in continuing civil dialogue work to identify those conversations that can be productive from those that should be avoided?
That's a great question. I mean, exploring a disagreement through civil discourse takes a lot of emotional management. And so if we feel ourselves getting angry and our judgment getting clouded and we're getting defensive, it might be time for us to just take a step back, ask if we can return to this conversation. I've sometimes said, I feel myself getting defensive, or, the way that we're talking about this, I'm just getting really tense. And I think I need to come back to this. I don't think I can keep having this conversation right now. So that sort of self-awareness of whether you're in a place where you're ready to explore this through civil discourse, as opposed to just express emotions about the situation. I think that's really the most important thing. And for all of us to recognize that no matter how mature you are, or rational you are, or good at managing your emotions, we're emotional creatures, and sometimes we're going to be too upset to talk about something, or something is too close to us, too personal, and we're just going to have to um, avoid conversations until we feel like we can handle it in the right sort of way. And that's okay to do. It's okay to be unprepared in the moment to have a conversation.
That's a perfectly fitting closing. Catherine Joyce, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.